And nothing bad happened. We just felt like God was calling us away. It was almost about 4.5 years. We felt like the time was probably coming to a close and didn't want to burn any bridges or hurt any feelings. And so we began to seek out a ministry and pray about it, and we ended up in Shoals, Indiana, which is about an hour and a half where my wife grew up, so that really worked out for her. And when I was talking to the elders on the phone, through a phone interview, I said, look, I've got a 3-year-old son, I've got a son who's on the road. And I said, it would be very important to me, and if this is not something you can do, I understand, I'll pray for you, you pray for me. I want at least my son to have the chance to start and to graduate in the same school system. A lot of preachers didn't get that opportunity. I did. And they've held true to their word, and I've held true to mine. He's going to graduate next year, Lord willing, from Shoals Community Schools. His brother Robert will be a sophomore when Jonathan graduates. Their brother Isaiah will be going into 3rd grade when his brother graduates. And my son Josiah should be in kindergarten or 1st grade. I can't keep track anymore. I've quit asking. I just wake up and whatever happens, happens. We have 4 boys. Isaiah, or Jonathan, who is 17. Robert, or he'll be 17 in February. Robert, who is 13. Isaiah, who is 5. And Josiah, who is 3. So, I didn't know I was going to start a new family when I was in Shoals, but I did. And so now I've got one in 11th grade, one in 8th grade, and one in kindergarten, and still one who's waiting to start school, and he can't understand why he can't go to school with the rest of his brothers. My wife and I met at Johnson Bible College, now Johnson University. We'll be married for 23 years, I think it is. I guess I better know that for sure. 23 years in January, so it's been a great ride. And yes, my dad is Tony Sullivan. He may have held a revival here at some point. I know Jimmy knows him, and they've done revivals and stuff together and known one another for years. And he's preaching this morning at Lester Road Christian Church. He's been there for as long as I've been at Shoals. Dad's been at Lester Road, so that kind of worked itself out. This morning we're going to spend all week. I've decided, and I prayed about this, and Jason kind of gave me some of the freedom to do this. We're going to spend this week as much as we can in the first 6 chapters of Daniel. Now, I do that because as we've seen over the course, and you have seen it up close and personal over the last couple of weeks, we've seen that we live in a culture that is increasingly hostile to Christians, especially Christians who live out their faith. That's what you're going to see. In fact, if you look through history, in fact, the book of Revelation, it tells us about 7 real churches that really existed. And if you go through there, you'll notice there are 4 churches that seem to be doing okay. There's one church that seems to be having a real issue, with a real problem, and there's 2 churches that are just under heavy persecution. Philadelphia and Smyrna. In fact, Jesus through the angel, through John says, you're going to die. It says, be faithful until death. The Greek there just says, wait, because you're going to die. Just be faithful until you die. And the reason, if you look through the historical part of Revelation, not necessarily the book itself, but the historical part of Revelation, that's happening is because those 2 churches seem to be standing up for Christ in a very, very difficult culture. But the churches who aren't standing up for Christ, the churches that aren't really representing Christ the way they should, they seem to be breezing through. The same is true in our culture. If your church is just kind of breezing through and if your church on Sunday morning looks a lot like the world Monday through Saturday, you may not have any trouble in the culture. Because it takes a lot of work to persecute a whole group of people. So you may not be worth the trouble to persecute. But if you're out there living your faith and your church is out there representing Christ like it should, I'm afraid we're going to find ourselves in some very harrowing situations before long. I don't know that we'll be as far along as some of our brothers and sisters in other countries who are being killed for their faith. I don't know that I'll see that or my kids will see that. But it's going to be a lot different, I'm afraid, if something doesn't change. Now, we're always praying for it to get better, but we need to be ready in case it doesn't. I don't know if you saw this article. It's been several years ago now. It was in the New York Times. And I saw this and I thought, man, this is hilarious. It takes place in India. I have one of my elders is chairman of a mission that runs a hospital in India. And every once in a while we'll bring Dr. Paul and his family over, and Mark Harper, who's one of our elders, our chairman of the board, he's the president of that board. And so I'm pretty familiar with India. I've not gotten to go yet. I wanted to go in February. Things didn't work out. And so hopefully in a couple more years I'll be able to go over to India and work with them for a few weeks and help teach and train some preachers over there. But if you know anything about India, you know it's filled with people. You can't hardly move in some of the places. Mike told me, him and his wife been over there several times, without seeing people. And it's only been within the last 15, 20 years, something like that, they have began to introduce cars in India. Usually got around by motorcycles, sometimes scooters, bicycles. They even had elephants. People would even get from one place to another riding elephants, but they introduced cars. Here's what the article said in the New York Times. A few weeks ago, the traditional Indian family household of Vincent Sharma achieved a long-deferred dream. Having ferried themselves on scooters all these years, the Sharmas bought a brand new silver-gray hatchback. Never mind that none of the 6 adults that were in the household knew how to drive. No sooner had the car arrived than Mr. Sharma, 34, took it out for a spin and knocked over his friend. His brother slammed into a motorcyclist, fortunately not injuring anybody. The brother was so scared he decided not to get behind the wheel again until Sunday, when the roads were a little freer of traffic. But you understand, right? The culture. Oh, my neighbor's got a car. I guess I should have a car. Never mind that I don't know how to drive the car. Never mind that I don't know how to operate it, then I'm going to be a danger to anybody who unfortunately gets in my way. I got to have one because everybody else has one. And that's the challenge we're going to face as we come to Daniel chapter 1. We encounter that very quickly, where they're trying to take these young men and they're trying to bring them into their culture. But before we do that, I want to start back with a little history in 2 Kings chapter 2. Because it's important to know why what's happening is happening in the book of Daniel. This didn't just happen all of a sudden. There was a reason these things are happening. So we need to set the stage for what's happening. Because one of the things that is true about the Old Testament, and you'll see this, the first blank I think there on your outline is this, is that God honored the obedience of His people. If you were looking through the Old Testament, you know that when God's people were obedient to Him, He honored them. And He made sure that good things happened to them. But if you're going to be disobedient, He was going to choose to bring discipline into their life, and He was going to try to draw them back to Him. Well, this is the case in the days just before Daniel. There was this significant time of disobedience in God's people. So if you just go back to the middle of the Old Testament to 2 Kings, think of just a brief passage here in 2 Kings chapter 20. It's going to set the stage for what's going to happen in the book of Daniel. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about Hezekiah. You remember Hezekiah? He was on his deathbed and he prayed for what? He prayed for more time. He did not want to die. God honored his request and granted him 15 more years of life. God honored his request, and so he got an extra season of life. And after he gets well from his sickness, and God has healed him and given him more time, he receives these visitors from Babylon. They come to Jerusalem to see Hezekiah. And this is where we pick up the story, 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 12. At that time, Merodach-Baladan, son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent Hezekiah letters and a gift because he heard of Hezekiah's illness. Hezekiah received the messengers and showed them all that was in his storehouses, the silver, the gold, the spices, and the fine oil, his armory, and everything found among his treasures. There was nothing in his palace or in all his kingdom that Hezekiah did not show them. Now let me ask you this morning, does that strike you as foolish? These are people that are at war. These are enemy of God's people. Babylon was an enemy of God's people. In fact, for those of you who kind of wait, and sometimes we read Daniel Revelation, get a little confused, and we let fiction like blood moons kind of rule us when we don't really read Scripture. If you want to know what Babylon is, Babylon was a real place in real time. But from then on out, any culture that stands against God and His wishes is Babylon. That's how horrible Babylon was. Babylon will never come back, but there will be Babylons that pop up occasionally. I think probably we're living in them. That stand against God and His wishes for His people. But this is the real Babylon. The real people come to God's king, Hezekiah, and Hezekiah just shows them everything. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense, right? You just wouldn't do that. Then Isaiah the prophet, verse 14, went to King Hezekiah and asked, "Why did those men say, and what did those men say, and where did they come from?" "From a distant land," Hezekiah replied, "they came from Babylon." The prophet asked, "What did they see in your palace?" "They saw everything in my palace," Hezekiah said. "There's nothing among my treasures that I did not show them." Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all that your fathers have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord, and some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, that will be born to you will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Then the word of the Lord you have spoken is good, Hezekiah replied. For he thought, will there not be peace and security in my lifetime? Hezekiah was a little arrogant. He's a little self-centered. He seems to think, I don't care what happens to my children. I don't care what happens to the people born in my household. I don't care what happens to the nation of Israel. As long as there's peace in my time. I don't care. Hezekiah didn't care. Well, if you just go over just a little bit more to 2 Chronicles, the story will continue. And we go just a little bit further into the development of what happened after Hezekiah's disobedience and his foolish disregard for the future of Israel. In fact, in chapter 36, starting in verse 5, it says this: Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord his God. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, attacked him and bound him with bronze shackles and take him to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar also took to Babylon articles from the temple of the Lord and put them in his temple there. And other events of Jehoiakim's reign, the detestable things he did, for all are found in the written record. We'll come back later to where the treasures have been stolen in the book of Daniel. But there's this pattern that's beginning to happen. There's these three exiles. Babylon's going to come in three different ways. They're going to take these men out. Verse 9. Jehoiakim was 18 years old when he became king. He reigned in Jerusalem for 3 months and 10 days. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. In the spring, Nebuchadnezzar sent for him and brought him to Babylon together with the articles of value from the temple of the Lord. And he made Jehoiachin's uncle Zedekiah king of Judah and Jerusalem. Verse 11, Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king. He reigned for 11 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord his God, did not humble himself before Jeremiah the prophet. He rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who made him take an oath. He became stiff-necked, hardened his heart, and would not return to the Lord. Furthermore, all the leaders of the priests and the people became more and more unfaithful, following all the detestable practices of the nation, and defiling the temple of the Lord, where he consecrated in Jerusalem. What's happening here is you've got God's people who are slowly but surely being sucked into the culture. They are becoming more and more like the people around them, and less like God. So here's what it says in verse 15. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to them through its messengers again and again, because he had pity on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked God's messengers. They despised his words. They scoffed at his prophets until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against his people, and there was no remedy. He brought up against them the king of Babylon, the king of the Babylonians, who killed their young men with the sword in the sanctuary and spared neither young man nor young woman, old man or aged. God handed them all over to Nebuchadnezzar. He carried to Babylon all the articles from the temple of God, both large and small, the treasures of the Lord's temple and the treasures of the king and his officials. They set fire to God's temple, and they broke down the wall of Jerusalem. They burned all the palaces and destroyed everything of value there. He carried into exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his sons. Disobedience brings discipline. Disobedience brings discipline. The Syria of exiles, 605 BC. That's when the first wave, that was the first time Babylon came in and carried off these people to their homeland. And in that first wave were 4 men that we've come to know as Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We're going to see their story over the next few weeks, a few nights. A few years later, 597, the second wave of exiles are brought. In 587, the final wave of exiles come in, and Israel was turned into a wasteland. Because of their disobedience to God, Israel was turned into a wasteland. There is no temple. There is no grounds. There's no palace for the king. There's no remnant of anybody in Israel because they did not do what God had said to do. And here's where we pick up the story of Daniel. Now, I don't know how old Daniel was, but Daniel must have been a very young man when this happened. Because at the end of the book of Daniel, Daniel is still alive, and he's praying to God because the 70 years are coming to an end. So Daniel has lived all of the time. So Daniel must have been somewhere around 12 or 13 years old, something like that. Some of you sitting here that same age, Daniel was as young as you are when he was taken from his homeland, taken from his family, exiled in the king's palace along with 3 of his friends, and they begin this process of turning these Jews into Babylonians. The whole reason Nebuchadnezzar takes these men, and they're not the only four, by the way, take a lot of them, over here, and they put them in this little Babylonian school, and they give them Babylonian names, is because they're trying to suck all the Jewishness out of them. They're trying to take all of the Jewish culture out of them so that they will become Babylonians. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get their name changed. Why? Because Daniel gets his name changed. Why? Because you're no longer Jews. You're going to become one of us. We're going to make you one of us. We're going to suck you in. We're going to do those kind of things. And that's what's happening here. Let's look at the story. Just listen, though, this morning. Think about it. In our culture, this is not going to get easier. And listen for the lines of resolve. Where do you hear the deep resolution within Daniel and his friends? And then listen for the places where God is active in His providence, because those are so important. Chapter 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim of Judah into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put in the treasures house of his God. Then the king ordered Zephaniah, chief of the court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among these were from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names: to Daniel, Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and Azariah, Abednego. You see what's happening here. You begin to see these young men who are very smart and appear to be very good looking, very healthy, men that they thought had some type of potential. He's going to put them into the king's palace, and they're going to start on this 3-year kind of term where they're going to do everything they can of having Babylonian culture influence upon them. Everything that they've known about the ways of God, everything they've known about being Jewish is about to be removed. And everything Babylonian is about to be imposed upon them. And here's where you hear from the very beginning that there's going to be this process whereby God is going to have to somehow get involved. Because if God doesn't get involved, Daniel and his friends are in a lot of trouble. But what you have happening here is what I would call the allure of the world. It should not surprise any of us, because that's the nature of every culture. The nature of every culture is to move into it, and when you live in it, the challenge is to try to let it totally become you. We live in a different culture. Peter says we are strangers, we are aliens, that we're just passing through. And we have to do our best while we live in this culture to not be drawn into it. But we face that challenge every day in American culture. They thrust it at us in the media, in our life, the way we do business. And it challenges us down to our very core when we try to decide whether or not we're going to be the people of God and be the people that God calls us to be, or if we're just going to be like everybody else. We come here a little further and look at Daniel, verse 8, where the next step is taken. Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. He asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, "I'm afraid of the Lord, my king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink, and then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance to what you see." So he agreed, and he tested them for 10 days. Now think about this. Daniel is probably 12 or 13 or 14 years old. And I have to confess to you, I'm absolutely amazed at his resolve. This 12 or 13 or 14-year-old young man facing the king, facing the king's official, living in a culture where he is totally out of place, he's been ripped from his roots, and he has the courage to say, "I don't want to do that. I don't want to be like everybody else. I'm not going to succumb to this." Let's try this. Let's do something else. That takes a lot of courage. I mean, what kind of courage does it take to make someone stand up against the culture when the culture does everything it can to turn you into something else? And the fascinating thing is that Daniel's not only tested by his culture at this point, but he puts God on the spot. Did you notice that? He puts God on the spot because the underlying assumption that Daniel is making is, don't worry, God's going to take care of this. He doesn't have any worries about what's going to happen over the next 10 days. He says God is going to be faithful, and if we're faithful, God is faithful. You try to see what happens, and let's see what God does. Here's what it says. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away the choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. And at the end of the time, the Bible says, set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. In verse 8, Daniel decides, I'm not going to succumb to this. And we already begin to see the activity of God. In verse 9. You see it, right? The resolve came first. Long before there was ever any evidence that God was going to come to his aid, Daniel had already made up his mind that what he was going to do, and he was just going to trust God to come and to take care of the situation. But you notice, the resolve came first, not later. It wasn't that Daniel knew what was going to happen, so he would go ahead and be resolved. No, he decided he was going to do no matter what was going to happen. The resolution was, is you choose to do what God wants you to do, to be the person that you're supposed to be, and then let God come to your aid. But I understand the problem with that, because that's not who we are. We want to see the activity of God up front. We want some kind of guarantee that this is all going to turn out okay. Because the fact is, folks, as American Christians, we've already made up our mind that life is supposed to turn out okay. I mean, that's the point, right? That's the point of living life, that everything's going to be okay. You become a disciple of Jesus, and then everything gets better. Everything turns out the way it's supposed to be. I don't know if you remember this. I vaguely remember this. I'm 45 years old. I was about 15 when this was going on. There was this phenomenon in the Philippines. Now, whatever was going on in the Philippines struck a chord in the United States, and hundreds and thousands probably of people went to the Philippines to visit what was going on. And they claimed that there were healers there, and they could heal you from being sick. And it was an unusual kind of healing. It wasn't what we see on American television where somebody comes and they lay hands on them and supposedly their disease disappears. This was a healing service where you could go to the Philippines, you would go to the healer, they would take your hand and they would take their hand, they would literally cut your body open. Understand? And they would pull out what was supposed to be the malignant tumors or whatever it was, and they would spread their hands over you, and then you would walk away with a scar. And there was evidence, they claimed that this was really true, this was really happening, and so people were just flocking to the Philippines to go get healed, and they were so excited, and they proclaimed that there was evidence that it worked, and so supposedly they had brought back to the United States pictures of the surgeries they had produced, the tissues that had been taken out. People said it was cancerous, and so people were going crazy, and a lot of people want to go to the Philippines. They want to go get healed, and because everybody likes health, and everybody wants to be healthy. So there was a guy, his name was Clarence, and he heard about this, and he decided he was going to go. I'm going to go to the Philippines. So he tells the preacher, he tells the elders, I'm not going to be here. I'm going to the Philippines. I'm sick. I'm going to go. He had some illnesses that he wanted to have healed. But the elders and the evangelists knew that this was not a good idea. And so they knew he should not go there. And so they did their homework. They didn't just attack him. They did their homework. And they figured out that what actually was happening was and the people who were doing this, the healers, were involved in the occult. Now, they were satanic. I don't know what all else was going on, but whatever power they were having, it was not coming from God. And so the elders and the preacher go to Clarence's house and they try to convince him not to go. They're like, Clarence, you can't do this. This is evil. You're going to end up in a place you don't want to be. Clarence, please don't do this. It's not safe spiritually for you to go. And this was Clarence's response. He says, well, I've prayed and I've told God that if He doesn't want me to go, He can stop me. But if God doesn't stop me from going, I'm going to go. And so they said, well, how would you like for Him to do that? How's God going to stop you, Clarence? Might not give you a ticket when you ask for one. Maybe God won't let your passport get validated. Maybe the bus will break down on the way to the airport. Clarence, do you think it's possible that the reason that your leadership from your church, who cares about you deeply, is sitting in your living room is because God does not want you to go? But see, Clarence had already made up his mind. He had decided what he was going to do. He was just going to let God. He didn't care. Because he wasn't going to put his resolve ahead of what God was doing. He was going to force God to do what He thought was best. And that's not how God operates. Saying, God, if you don't want me to go, stop me. I'm sorry, He's not going to do that. But we're so convinced that everything's going to turn out right, we just do what we think we're going to do. God will take care of us. I don't know if you heard of the preacher Zaire. He was a young preacher who was arrested. He was in prison preaching, and they had trumped up all these charges against him and put him in jail, and they sentenced him to 2 years. Literally millions and millions and millions of people around the world were praying for his release. They were praying that somehow the government would respond in a humane way. There are people who they appealed to the government. There were people there who went on behalf of human rights organizations to get him treated with dignity and fairness. And no matter what they did, the family and friends of that preacher told him that that no matter what happened, that the prison officials were demanding high payments before they would give him food and allow him to meet relatives. They wouldn't allow him to eat if they did not bribe the prison guards. Millions of people were praying and asking God to intervene on his behalf. And it was just getting worse. He lodged a second appeal sometime in the not-too-distant future. He will go to the Supreme Court and they will consider this. If they did not choose to release him, he has no choice but to stay in prison until they just want to let him go. There's no system over there. Now, there's nothing wrong with millions of people praying. Life just doesn't always come out the way we think it should. It just doesn't do that. And the question is, when that happens, is God there or not? In fact, that's not even the question. The question actually is not whether or not God is actually there, because God is there. The question is, am I going to be faithful in Babylon even for 70 years? Because I think what you're going to see in the book of Daniel is the absolute sovereignty of God and how that should empower us to be faithful. God does not take us out of difficulty. He does not move us out of the world in which we have been taken captive. He does not necessarily make life easier, but He will empower us to be faithful in the context, if you're willing to do it and you've got the resolve. And that is the challenge this morning. The challenge is to resolve to be the person that God is calling you to be, no matter what. In the New Testament, there's this little text that's tucked away. We run across it every once in a while. And if you've never run across it, you certainly should. And if you haven't, I want to introduce you to that text today. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Marvelous text. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, that says, "There is no temptation that has seized you, but such as has common to man." But the problem is, you don't want to stop reading there. He says, nothing ever comes into our path to tempt us that hasn't been in somebody else's path. We're not unique. The temptations that we face have been faced before. They are hard temptations. They are difficult temptations. But look at the next line. There is nothing that has come to tempt you bigger than you are. God is faithful and will make a way. Remember, what comes your way, if you will put the resolve to do what God's called you to do, God will make a way no matter what. If you resolve to live for God, He will be faithful. There will be a way out if you choose to take it. See, the world is going to appeal to you. The world is going to come to you and it's going to make claims on you to be like the rest of us. And while the rest of the world says, be like us, God says, be like my Son. When the world comes to you and says, well, you know what, everybody's doing it, God says, you be faithful to me. The world's going to come along and it's going to say, it won't hurt you. God is going to say, maybe not today, but it might hurt you tomorrow. And while the world says to you, it's fun, God says, is it worth it? Can you imagine? Can you imagine this morning if 5 rows of young people decided to be faithful? If they decided to just live like Christians, what kind of impact that would have in the school systems? I wonder what it would be like if a wrestler or a cross-country runner or a volleyball player would just say, I'm going to be a Christian, I'm going to live for Christ, I don't care what the rest of you do. I wonder what kind of difference that might make. I wonder what kind of difference it would make in your workplace if every believer in that workplace just stood up and said, I don't care what happens, I'm going to be faithful, I'm going to resolve and trust that God can do what God's going to do. What if the families within our communities, if every father, every mother, if every young person said, we're going to be faithful to God and to do what God has called us to do, we don't care what anybody else does, and we don't care what anybody else says. I wonder what would happen if every Christian teacher just resolved they were going to live out their faith as fully as they could in the context of the place that they were in. What would happen if God's people just resolved to be faithful and to let God do whatever God wanted to do and just trust Him? What would happen? But you see, if you want to do that, we already have a model who's already done it. We have a model of somebody who hung right in there to the end, and even though it was going to cost him his life, he stayed and he took it. And if Jesus Christ could do that for you, surely you can turn around and do that for Him. So that's the challenge we're going to be asking over the next few days, is to resolve to be followers of God in a culture that is increasingly hostile to who you are. It is increasingly hostile to be a Christian in our culture. It won't go over at all in almost any place. And if you find yourself not having any problems at work or at school or wherever you go, if everything is just fine and your day flies by, you might want to ask yourself how seriously you're living out your faith. Because when you live out your faith, people take notice. And some of those people don't like it. And they'll change you and they'll holler at you. The challenge we're going to be asking to make all through this week is to resolve to be faithful followers of God. So Jason's going to be down front. We're going to stand and sing this song. And we're going to try our best to resolve and to commit ourselves to be faithful.